Okay, we're going to look at a different way to solve quadratic equations in this video, or another option that works for some quadratic equations. It's called the square root property. And looking at this one, solve x squared equals 16. So we have been used to solving this because it's a quadratic, because it's a degree 2 up there, exponent is 2. We set it equal to 0 by subtracting 16. And then we factor this and solve it. So this is a difference of squares, so it'd be x minus 4 times x plus 4. By the zero product property, I set each equal to 0, and I get x equal to 4 and negative 4. Plug either of those into the original equation, and you'd have a solution. But I want to look at this in a little bit different way, and instead of using the zero product property, I want to use the square root property. Because what's this equation asking? X squared equals 16. It's asking for what number times itself, that's the x squared, is equal to 16. Think about that. What number times itself? We have an operation for that. That's square root. When I take the square root of a number, it's asking what number times itself is this number. So if I have x squared equals 16, and I'm looking for just x, I can take the square root of both sides. Right? In math, we have this general principle that if I do the same thing to both sides, it's okay. So if I take the square root of both sides, I keep the equation in balance, and on the left, well, the square root of x squared, they just undo each other, and I'm left with x is equal to, but this is where it's important. When you take the square root, you have to remember a plus or minus. So x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 16. What is the square root of 16? It's 4. So x is equal to plus or minus 4. Because why the plus or minus? If I go backwards, it's not only true that 4 squared is equal to 16, but if I leave just there, I'm missing half my information. Because there's another number that when you square it is equal to 16, and that is negative 4. And that's a special number. It is the negative of your original number up here of 4. So the idea there, you have to remember to put that plus or minus in front of your square root when you take the square root of both sides. And this square root property is really easy to apply. It goes quick. On this next one, solve x squared equals 81. So x squared is equal to 81. Just rewriting it. Well, because I have a square alone on one side, I have x squared alone, a perfect square there. I can take the square root of both sides, and that just drops out to be x, but it's equal to plus or minus the square root of 81. I have to remember that plus or minus. So that is equal to plus or minus 9, which means I have two solutions, 9 and negative 9. Two solutions, as I would expect from a quadratic equation. Because of that degree 2, I expect two solutions. We can see this problem in a little bit different light, where this one is asking to solve y minus 6 squared is equal to 81. Now I can use the square root property on this because I have a perfect square alone on one side. Okay, so y minus 6 is a perfect square. It looks a little funky because it's not just a single number or a single variable, but it is something being squared, and it's all alone on one side. Since that's the case, I can just take the square root of both sides, square root, and because it's just one term being squared on this left side, it drops out to be y minus 6, but on the other side, it's plus or minus square root of 81. Always remember plus or minus. Always do plus or minus when you take the square root of both sides of an equation. Otherwise, you'll miss half your answer. But notice, y is not solved for yet. It's still being subtracted 6 from. So I need to keep going and solving this equation. So I have y minus 6 is equal to plus or minus 9. Here, I should split it into two equations, because one is going to equal positive 9, and the other is going to equal negative 9. and those two give me the two values that I have for y. Solve the left one and I add 6, so y is equal to 15. And solve the right one by adding 6. Negative 9 plus 6 is equal to a negative 3. So in this case, the solutions are y is equal to 15 or negative 3. So word of caution, what I've been saying, it has to be a perfect square alone on one side to take the square root. This does not work in a scenario like x squared plus 6x plus 8 equal to 0, and you say, well, I don't want to factor this. I want to use the square root property. So you subtract and you get the x squared alone, and you get x squared is equal to negative 6x minus 8. And then you're like, okay, I'll take the square root of both sides because I got a square alone on one side, and I have x equal to plus or minus the square root of negative 6x minus 8. Well, look what you have going on here. You don't have just a nice number under that square root. So you can't solve that and say you have a value for x, a numerical value. So whenever you have both an x squared term and an x term, you can't solve that with this square root property. It has to be just a squared term there on one side. So like we have over here y minus 6 being squared. That y minus 6 being our one term there, and it's being squared. So I have a square alone on one side without any variables on the other. Let's look at one more problem here. This one's got an interesting twist as well. So I do have a perfect square alone on one side and no variables over here. So I'm going to use the zero product property to solve this. And I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So it boils down to x plus 6 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 12. And remember, because I have x plus 6 being squared, and I'm taking the square root, I'm thinking what number times itself is x plus 6 squared? Well, x plus 6 times x plus 6 is x plus 6 squared. Therefore, the square root of it is x plus 6, as we have. Well, look what we have here. I have x plus 6 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 12. I can't simplify the square root of 12, but I can still solve for x, and I can subtract 6. So I have x equals plus or minus the square root of 12 minus 6. And notice built in there is two different solutions because of this plus or minus right there. But I can't just combine square root of 12 and minus 6. Can't add those together. They're not quite like terms. So I can just leave my answer as square root of 12 minus 6 and negative square root of 12 minus 6, which actually, that's a perfectly fine answer there, leaving it kind of unsimplified in the decimal, in the non-decimal version. So this is good. Even this is good, leaving it in that plus or minus notation. That's okay to do. But if you like your decimals, you can find the decimal answer of this by plugging in your calculator, a square root of 12 minus 6, and that will give you negative 2.54 and negative 9.46, of course rounded to two decimal places there.